clearly, in my view, right now, there are enough people to pass a government opening funding bill. And we will do so at the Republican suggested number of dollars. So there's no disagreement, no argument about dollars. Democrats are united and ready to help end this shutdown by voting for the Senate.
Without objection.
Further, I ask to be able to speak for up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
And I would request that my staffer, Ed Shellaby, be allowed to come to the floor.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about reopening the government. We're now 5 days into a government shutdown that should never have happened. Minnesotans do not want a government shutdown. They want us to do our jobs, not refight the same old political battles over and over again. With each day of this shutdown, I hear more and more reports about how it is affecting Minnesotans, as I'm sure the presiding officer hears about it is affecting the people of Maine. Minnesotans seeking basic government services are being turned away. Hundreds of people go to the Minneapolis Social Security office each day to get Social Security cards. But on the first day of the shutdown, according to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, those Minnesotans, some of whom took time off of work and drove long distances, arrived to find the card center closed. Minnesota small businesses are also feeling the impact. Small businesses in Minnesota received an average of $1.8 million in loans every day under the Small Business Administration's loan guarantee programs in 2012. With the government shut down, these programs will no longer take new applications, and our businesses have to put their plans on hold. And it's not just businesses that are facing problems getting access to loans. Minnesota is the home to a lot of great smaller financial institutions. I think we have the second most community banks in the country. We're home to a lot of credit unions, and I talk with them regularly. Earlier this week, I met with folks from some Minnesota credit unions, and they explained to me that as a result of the shutdown, they're having problems approving mortgages because the Social Security Administration can't verify Social Security numbers. That is not just bad for those Minnesotans who are trying to buy or sell a home, it's just also bad for the economy. This week, my office heard from one of those Minnesotans who is in the process of buying a home. Jesse is using a USDA rural development loan. His banker now has all of the documentation compiled and ready to be submitted to rural development for approval, but they're shut down. Jesse was originally supposed to close on October 11th, next Friday, and the sellers were scheduled to close on another property right after closing on the property they're selling to Jesse. Now, Jesse and his family are now living with his in-laws, and they have all their possessions in storage. He just doesn't know whether he's going to be able to close on his new home, all because some people thought it was a good idea to insist on shutting down the government to repeal the health care law, which isn't going to happen and never was going to happen. Jesse is really frustrated and disappointed. He felt compelled to let me know how this is affecting him, how it's affecting people, and they asked me to do whatever possible that I can do to end this shutdown quickly. The shutdown is also affecting other Minnesotans who depend on vital federal programs. Federal nutrition programs, for example. An estimated 125,000 Minnesota mothers and mothers-to-be depend on Women, Infants, and Children Program, or WIC, so that they can buy healthy food for their families. With the shutdown, no new federal funds are available to support WIC. That puts the program in Minnesota and the women and children that it serves at risk. Hopefully we can avoid any terrible consequences by getting the government up and running as quickly as possible, but in some other states, such as Utah, according to Forbes, they have already stopped accepting new participants. In a shutdown, the Administration for Community Living in the Department of Health and Human Services can't fund senior nutrition programs such as Meals on Wheels. Seniors who rely on Meals on Wheels face uncertainty, and if the shutdown goes on, state and local agencies local agencies are unable to replace the federal funding, outright inability to access the program. And that's why I will be donating my salary during the shutdown to Second Harvest Heartland. It's a great hunger relief organization that works throughout Minnesota to help people who need it to get food. Meanwhile, Minnesota's farmers can't get the resources that they need. Susan Magadens, a constituent of mine from Eden Valley in central Minnesota, works at the USDA Farm Service Agency. She wrote me, and I quote, "This shutdown has cut off services to thousands of American farmers. They cannot get grain checks released and are missing access to funds they require to carry out their operation," unquote. The shutdown is hitting Minnesotans in many other ways as well. The shutdown means that the National Institutes of Health is not awarding any new funds or making payments on recently awarded grants. The Mayo Clinic receives 40% of its research funding from NIH grants. And by the way, this is one of the many reasons we're going to have to address the sequester. This sequester has hit vital NIH funding really hard, though this is an agency that some people seem not to have noticed until the shutdown. Speaking of the effects of the shutdown compounding the damage from the sequester, tribal schools are being hit even harder because they get a substantial portion of their funding from the federal government in what is called impact aid. Impact aid is federal money that goes to school districts where federal property or federal activities significantly reduce the local tax base. The biggest recipients are schools on military bases and on Indian reservations. I have 11 tribes in Minnesota, and some of them get about a third of their school funding from the federal government. I'm on the Indian Affairs Committee, and I can tell you that sequestration has been hitting them even harder than it's been hitting other people. These are some of the most vulnerable kids in the country. Their after-school programs are being canceled because of the sequester. And now on top of that, impact aid is at even greater risk because of the shutdown. That is not right. It is just wrong. Some veteran services through the Department of Veterans Affairs are already being curtailed, and if the shutdown goes on for very much longer, VA will not be able to process benefits, claims, and payments, aggravating the claims backlog that we've been working so hard to address. These are just some of the effects that the shutdown is having on Minnesotans. People are suffering. Minnesotans who have written me and called my office want Congress to get things done, to do our work and not shut down the government. More than a week ago, I voted with the presiding officer and a majority of my colleagues in the Senate and passed a bill to keep the government open and prevent the damage that a shutdown does to our country and to our economy. The House could take up that bill and pass it in a matter of hours, and it would reopen the government immediately. It has been widely reported that enough Republicans and Democrats support that bill for it to pass in the House if Speaker Boehner would only put it up for a vote in the House. That's all he needs to do. Let the full House vote on the continuing resolution. But the House hasn't done that. Instead, a faction of the Republicans in the House has decided that rehashing old political fights and political brinksmanship are more important than getting back to the job that we were sent here to do, which is putting Americans back to work, improving our education, strengthening our economic recovery. Earlier this week, I was asked what I would be working on if there were no shutdown. Well, one of the main things I would be doing is working to pass my Community College to Career Fund Act. This legislation is aimed at closing what is called the skills gap. What is the skills gap? Well, recent studies in Minnesota show that about a third to a half of all manufacturers in our state have jobs that they need filled, but they can't fill because they don't have people with the skills to fill them. There are more than 3 million of those jobs across the country that are going unfilled because of the lack of workers with the right skills. My bill would help those companies that have open positions. It would help workers find jobs. It would help our country be more competitive globally. It would address college affordability. It's the kind of thing we need to be doing. Now, I have seen partnerships between businesses and community colleges in Minnesota that work. At Hennepin Technical College in Hennepin County, for example, a group of manufacturers worked with the school, Hennepin Technical College, created a curriculum where students could get a credentialized degree, a credential. I went to a round table there, and they told me that they had put over 300 students through this course, and 93% of them had permanent jobs. Now, the manufacturers who were involved in this partnership had skin in the game. They gave Hennepin Tech machines. They helped design the curriculum. And now they have people filling the jobs that need to be filled. I've seen this model work throughout Minnesota, and I've seen it work throughout our country. But we still have a skills gap, and that's why my bill would create a competitive grant program to incentivize partnerships between businesses and community colleges. This isn't just manufacturers, it's in healthcare, it's in IT. It would incentivize businesses and community colleges to create programs targeted at getting workers the skills that they need to fill these jobs. This is what I want to be working on. This is what the presiding officer wants to be working on for the people of Maine. This is the kind of thing Americans sent us here to do. Americans want us to learn from strategies that are succeeding in our states, in Minnesota, in Maine, and then work together to make our country more prosperous and stronger. What else are we supposed to do? That's why they sent us here. I recognize that we have political differences that we have to work through. But brinksmanship and crises can't be the rule. They should be the exception. After the debt ceiling crisis in 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded our nation's credit rating, and they cited the dysfunction in Congress as the main reason. After that, people thought, I believe most people in this country thought, okay, well, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to govern by crisis and brinksmanship. And in fact, this year, in March, the Senate passed a budget through the regular process, through regular order. And the House passed a budget. It's a different budget, but that's the way it works. And then you get together for a conference. We have sought for months to have a conference with the House to resolve the differences in regular order. But we were stopped by the same senators who thought it was a good idea to shut down the government to defund the Affordable Care Act. And the House has simply refused to go to conference. Instead, they waited for the government shutdown and then sought to go to conference on a 2.5-month continuing resolution that would delay the health care law for a year. That is irresponsible. Minnesotans and Americans, they want us to govern responsibly. Brenda Gorrich from Duluth wrote me on Wednesday about her husband, a disabled veteran whose disability benefit is now further delayed due to the shutdown. She says, and I quote, "We would rather do without than have you give in to delaying the Affordable Care Act. Please stand strong and do not let anyone change or delay this. We will sit tight without income while you work towards this," unquote. And overwhelmingly, Americans do not want us to shut down the government to stop the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And earlier this week, Minnesota's health care exchange opened and, according to Minnesota Public Radio, received approximately 100,000 web hits on its first days, the second highest numbers of hits in any state. And believe me, we are not the second largest state. So the shutdown is not actually stopping implementation of the health care law. Instead, the shutdown is threatening to do serious damage to our economy. Today, jobless claims are close to a 5-year low. The second quarter of 2013 marked 9 consecutive quarters of economic growth. The private sector has created 7.5 million jobs over the last 42 months. There are more people on private non-farm payrolls than at any time since September of 2008. But the shutdown is putting our still fragile economic recovery in jeopardy. Moody's chief economist, Mark Zandi, testified before the Senate a few weeks ago that a shutdown lasting just a few days would cost the economy approximately 0.2% of GDP, and a longer shutdown could cost as much as 1.4%. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has called on Congress to keep the government open, stating, and I quote, "It is not in the best interest of the U.S. business community or the American people to risk even a brief government shutdown that might trigger disruptive consequences or raise new policy uncertainties washing over the U.S. economy," unquote. This shutdown is painful for our constituents, and it is damaging the economy. And everyone should understand this is costing the government money. Some people may think, well, at least if the government is shut down, we're saving money. But actually, the very opposite is the case. Recently in the New York Times, they had an editorial that detailed some of the reasons that shutdowns end up being very expensive. A shutdown government can't collect fines and fees. Contractors build in the cost of the shutdown and the added probability of future shutdowns to how much they charge the government. Furloughing government workers means lost productivity. Lost economic output means lower tax revenue for federal, state, and local governments. This shutdown is unnecessary and it is irrational. Please, let's reopen the government and get back to the work that the people elected us to do. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, today marks the 5th day of the government shutdown. With each passing day, the consequences grow more severe, more people are affected, and the implications grow far more serious. Federal civilian employees working to support our National Guard, overhaul our nuclear submarines, and analyze the latest terrorist threat are being furloughed, leaving us less safe as a country. Now, I understand that this afternoon Secretary Hagel, in response to a letter that the presiding officer and I signed along with many of our colleagues, is recalling some of those civilian workers. But there are still other implications. Disabled veterans who have sacrificed so much for this country are facing delays in the handling of their claims. Pregnant women and little children who depend on the foods provided by the WIC program are at risk. And vital biomedical research is being disrupted such that even the sickest children cannot enroll in clinical trials at the National Institutes of Health. And the impact goes beyond these services provided by essential federal programs. Jobs in the private sector are affected as well. In Maine, our gem of a national park, Acadia National Park, is shuttered during the peak of the foliage season. This not only disappoints tourists, it hurts innkeepers, owners of bed and breakfast organizations, servers at restaurants, and small gift shop entrepreneurs who depend on these tourists during this time of year. The list of harm goes on and on and on and worsens with each passing day. It is time, Mr. President, for this shutdown to end. Mr. President, from the start of this debate, I've urged our House colleagues not to adopt a policy that linked Obamacare with the funding of government. I've been outspoken in my own opposition to Obamacare and have cast many a vote consistent with that position. I've co-sponsored and introduced bills to reform the law so that we can better rein in health care costs and truly help the uninsured without jeopardizing their jobs and without imposing billions of dollars of new taxes, fees, and penalties that discourage job creation and drive up costs. But the fact is, Mr. President, the Democratic Senate is never going to pass, nor is President Obama ever going to sign a bill that repeals his signature accomplishment. So now that we have all made crystal clear where we stand on Obamacare, it is past time that we reason together on how to bring this impasse to an end. In that regard, I must express my own disappointment in the lack of results from the President's meeting with congressional leaders and what I understand to be the President's refusal to enter into negotiations with Congress. So let me present to my colleagues and to the President for their consideration a proposal to bring an end to the shutdown. The proposal is based on concepts that have been discussed by Senator Pat Toomey and Congressman Charlie Dent, and they also reflect my own personal discussions with many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Mr. President, even the staunchest advocates of Obamacare, including the President himself, recognize that the law is not perfect. What 2,000-plus page law dealing with extremely complex issues could be? The President himself has delayed implementation of the employer mandate and certain consumer protections. I have, therefore, searched for common ground on reforming Obamacare, seeking a proposal that has widespread bipartisan support in order to attract the necessary votes of our House colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And that is the repeal of the 2.3% tax on the sales of medical equipment. When such an amendment repealing this tax was considered by the Senate during the budget resolution, it passed by a resounding vote of 79 to 20. Clearly, it has strong bipartisan support. This $30 billion tax on medical devices such as pacemakers and defibrillators will cause the loss of as many as 43,000 domestic jobs, according to industry estimates. It will reduce investment in research to produce new medical devices, and ironically, it will increase health care costs because the manufacturers will simply pass on the cost to consumers. Now, the administration has protested the idea of repealing this tax because it would lose $30 billion in revenue over the next 10 years. Fair enough. Let's make up for the lost revenue by providing an offset. It's a complicated one, but it works. It's called pension smoothing. It would smooth out the amount of payments that businesses make into pension plans. This is not an unusual concept. New York State has adopted it to allow local school systems to reduce their annual pension contributions somewhat next year in exchange for higher payments in future years. The result of allowing private businesses to smooth out their pension contributions would produce tax revenue by lowering their deductions, and that could be used to offset the cost of repealing the tax on medical equipment. Second, I would propose that the continuing resolution funding government include a bipartisan bill that Senator Mark Udall and I introduced earlier this year to give agencies flexibility to deal with sequestration. It makes no sense at all for federal managers not to be able to set priorities and then submit their plans to the appropriations committees as they do now with reprogramming requests. Sequestration is a flawed policy. It does not discriminate between absolutely essential programs and those that are duplicative, wasteful, or simply less important. Now, it is Congress that should be making these decisions, but if across-the-board MEAT cuts of sequestration stay in effect, the least we can do is let federal managers set priorities and manage their budgets subject to congressional oversight. Mr. President, it is my hope that if repeal of the medical equipment tax offset fully by the pension smoothing proposal, plus the Collins-Udall flexibility bill, were combined with a continuing resolution to fund government, we might well have the combination necessary to secure the votes and reopen government. Surely it is worth a try. So on this late Saturday afternoon, I offered this proposal and I urge my House colleagues to send us such a bill, which I would then urge the Senate Majority Leader to schedule for an immediate vote. Mr. President, we have a lot to do to restore the public's confidence in our ability to govern. We can start by offering and voting on specific proposals such as this one. It is time that both sides come out from their partisan corners, stop fighting, and start legislating in good faith. The shutdown represents a failure to govern and must be brought to an end. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am not happy to be here, but it is an honor and a privilege to be on the Senate floor representing the people of Louisiana and speaking for constituents around the country on this important subject. And it's unfortunate that we're here today because of the irresponsible behavior of one group of members from one party in basically one chamber. And while I most certainly respect my colleague from Maine and think that the proposal that she's generally outlined has a lot of merit, and I would add there will probably be 15, 20, or 25 other senators from both parties who have worked together to find common ground on many, many issues that could come up with equally meritorious proposals. It misses a very important point. And the point is simply that the House Republicans and a handful of Senate Republicans have forced the government into a shutdown, hurting their own constituents, hundreds of thousands of their own constituents, and small businesses in their district who don't deserve in any way to be dragged into this fight or to be used as bait in these negotiations. That point cannot be understated and it cannot be ignored. This whole issue is not caused because neither side can compromise or we can't find common ground. We've proven that over and over and over again on hundreds of issues. I myself, along with a senator from Maine, and you, who are new here, the presiding officer, but not new to government, have been part of dozens of extraordinary efforts when there didn't seem to be any way forward to find a way. So we know how to do that. We can do it. The problem is that there is a rump group of Republicans and the Republican House leadership that has made a terrible mistake in shutting the government down and putting government workers and our private sector partners, and I want to underscore, our private sector partners. This government does not work with just federal employees alone. They do a bulk and wonderful work, many of them do, that we rely on every day. Our neighbors, our relatives, our, aunts, uncles, etc. But the real power is not just with them, it's with the private sector that helps this government and our nonprofit, not-for-profit sector that joins with us in fulfilling the missions, the important missions of government that have been put at risk. What that rump group did, though, was basically take all of this hostage until they get something. And what they want to date is not clear. They want many things all sorts of different things. One of them is to repeal the Affordable Care Act or to dismantle it in such a way that it can't work to provide, for the first time in the history of America, affordable access to health insurance. There are other reasons that have been stated. They don't like the spending levels, they don't like the debt, they don't like Democrats generally, they don't like President Obama. I mean, there have been many things I've read about what they've said. But no matter what they've said, their actions are irresponsible, reckless, and neither the President nor the Democrats should enter into negotiation with a gun to our constituents' heads. That's as simple as it is. There's a difference, but it's an important difference. House Republicans cannot get Democrats to any negotiating table unless they put the weapons down. These weapons are being used against their own constituents and their own businesses in their own districts, and it is not fair. I want to read from one of my constituents who says it better than I could. It's one of the messages that came into our office. We've been closed but functioning with a small staff. This message is from Vicki Cusimano, whose wife, Mark, is a 13-year military veteran who works on planes as a technician at one of our great air stations, Belle Chase, Louisiana, which, by the way, would be on high alert today because there's a storm out in the Gulf of Mexico. Thank goodness it's not a hurricane, but it's a tropical storm, Karen, that has put the whole Gulf Coast, you know, a little bit on edge. It's not a huge and powerful storm, but these storms are unpredictable, as you know from the coastal state yourself, how these things can happen. Anyway, Belle Chase is right there. Vicki is there as well with her husband, Mark, a 13-year veteran. She says they, speaking of Congress, just pushed us away and said, hey, we're going to fight and you're going to pay for it. Well, they're still getting paychecks. We're not. And now we're trying to figure out how we're going to fend for our families. That's what Mark said. Vicki says, we have bills to pay. And you can't tell Wells Fargo, sorry, I can't pay my house note today because the federal government has furloughed my husband. So I want to clarify, because I've been one of the ones saying, you know, we do need to negotiate, but we need to negotiate without a gun to our head. We need to negotiate when the House decides and the House recognizes that their reckless behavior cannot be encouraged, that it's wrong. And I know it's hard when you make a mistake to admit you're wrong. It's very difficult to do, but this would be a time to do it. And then move on to negotiations that we can have over everything, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, whether it's the budget, whether it's the appropriations. I'm chair of the Homeland Security Appropriations Bills. I most certainly know how to negotiate a major bill, $42 billion. Dan Coates is my ranking member from Indiana. We've been in negotiations literally on and off for years as partners on the Homeland Security bill. But when we asked the Democrats and the President, but the Democrats asked to go to the budget conference to work out the differences between the budget in the House, the Ryan budget, and the budget in the Senate, the Murray budget, which unusually was passed on during the same week. People won't even remember this because it was so long ago. It was sometime in April. The House passed their budget after an open, raucous debate. We passed our budget. I think we stayed on the floor until 5 o'clock in the morning, as I recall. I can remember being very tired, and everybody was pretty aggravated. But we stayed here, and we got our work done. So when people call for negotiation, the time for negotiation was then, and we can still have this 6-month delayed negotiation. But the House Republicans, the Tea Party Republicans and House Republicans have to put their weapons down. You cannot negotiate with a gun to your head. And it's not fair. It's not just to ours, but it's to our constituents and to our businesses on their behalf. I'm saying to my delegation and to the House Republicans, don't use these reckless and irresponsible tactics. And in addition, don't even threaten, don't even use the threat of not living up to the full faith and credit of the United States of America. You are really playing with fire then. And that's what I believe the President is saying. That's what Democrats are saying. Now, we have proven it's not a matter of conjecture or a matter of guessing or a matter of, well, they say they negotiate, but they really won't. This is the record. I mean, here is the record. This is evidence. This is not something anybody made up, and it's in the congressional record. I'm not going to read the whole sheet here, but I'm going to say that what this says is on 19 separate occasions, Senator Reid or Senator Murray or Senator Wyden or one of the Democrats came to the floor. Here are the dates: April 23rd, May 6th, May 7th, May 8th, May 9th, May 14th, May 15th, May 16th, May 21st, May 22nd, et cetera, June 19th, 26th, July, August, and then the latest was September of, October 2nd. Okay, those are the facts. And on every single occasion, there were 5 senators that stood up on behalf of the others here and blocked it and said, no, we cannot, we will not go to budget conference. Those senators were Senator McConnell on May 8th, Senator McConnell on May 9th, et cetera, Senator Paul on May 21st, Senator Toomey on June 19th, Senator Cruz, who's been the leader of this irresponsible and reckless strategy, which is getting, I don't think, his party or his future anywhere, but I will have to see about that. Mike Lee on July 17th, and then Senator Rubio on July 1. And I asked for 5 more minutes.
Is there objection? Hearing none.
So this is the record. When people say Democrats have been willing to negotiate, that is false, false, false. We have been trying to negotiate for 6 months, and the way you negotiate is going to a budget committee. Now, we are in control of the Senate. The people elected us. No one appointed me here. The people of the United States elected us in a fair and square election. Some of us won by a lot, some of us won by small amounts, but this was an election by the people of the United States. The people elected the Republican leadership in the House. They passed a budget, we passed a budget. All we have to do is go to conference. But not everyone in Washington is reckless. Not everyone loves to fight over our constituents' misfortune of unemployment and lack of business. There's a small group that put them on the chopping block, and they need to take them off. They should not be used as fodder in political fighting and debate. It is not right. That's the argument. So when they remove the constituents and refund the government and put the government open again, we could then ask to go to conference. This time, they should say yes. They just have to not show up, sit in your desk, and just not say anything, don't object, we'll go to conference. In the budget conference, then, you put everything on the table, everything. You can talk about anything you want. You can talk about taxes, no taxes. You can talk about how much money you want to spend overall. And most importantly, you can decide how much revenue, how much tax. That is what the American people want, is a budget. We haven't had one for a while. We need to get one. We've had spending limits, but we've not had a budget. We've spending limits, but we've not had a budget. Let's get a budget. Then those of us that are appropriators, and I'm one of those, and I'm in charge of help to try to build the Homeland Security budget, the chairman then will give us the number that's agreed to by Democrats and Republicans, and they'll say to me and to Senator Coates, okay, you have X amount of money to spend, you've got lots and lots of requests out there, you've got lots and lots of responsibility. Let me just list a few. Securing the entire border of the United States, all airports, all land ports, all river ports. We have to check all the cargo that comes into the country. Our budget funds TSA, not the most popular group, but we try to keep our air travelers safe and support international commerce at every level. Every business traveler that's trying to cut a deal in Germany or in England or in Asia has to get either pre-clearance or global entry or travel. We support that effort. We want our businesses out there making contracts, bringing jobs to America, increase. We can't do that if this budget doesn't get done. So give us a number. We'll put the best we can together. We will live within the restrictions that are given to us or the guidelines that are given to us. We will not spend 1 penny more than what the budget tells us. But we can't even get there because not everyone is being reckless. Not everyone is being unreasonable. There is a clearly identifiable group led by the senator from Texas. One of his colleagues, or one of the press, I'm not sure who, but it was a great quote, said that Senator Cruz has led the Republican Party and the Tea Party into the middle of 8 lanes of traffic and walked away. 8 lanes of traffic with traffic coming both ways is a very unsafe and dangerous place to be. They're going to have to find their way to the side of that road. Open the government and then say yes to a budget conference where all things can be negotiated and have been for literally hundreds of years. This is not a new process that the United States Senate and the Congress have been undertaking. This is regular order. Now, I'm going to end here. This is day 5, and I want to put into the record, since they're in the middle of traffic now with no way, very few ways, safe ways out for them, but we could open the government and get to the negotiating table. I want to just put into the record that for businesses, just try to get this, for businesses, 800,000 workers. Now, I know they passed a bill just a little while ago to say these workers could be paid. You know, that's important to do. But, again, it's not just workers. What about the contracts that they're supposed to be giving out of the projects? They still don't have authorization, even if they come back to work to do that, and it's going to affect business. Let me say how much. The federal government spends $400 billion in the private sector. That's $1 billion a day. So this reckless behavior has already cost $5 billion. Every day, $1 billion gone. Now, is their resolution in the House going to reinstate that $1 billion that small businesses have lost, or businesses generally? I don't think so. I didn't read the fine print. I don't think that's in there. Every day, if you say that 25% of all of our contracts should go to 5 business, that's $240 million a day for small businesses lost. And in one bank, and let me just say this, and then the government roughly loans about 150 loans to small businesses every day. So we're in day 5. That's 600 loans gone. And I could go on with every day how this affects business. So I'm happy to see, in conclusion, that the House, in realizing that they're in a bad, bad situation, has sent a lifeline out to the 800 federal employees, their own constituents that they put on the chopping block and took those paychecks as negotiating fodder because they don't like a bill that passed 3 years ago, upheld by the federal government, and is being instituted in the majority of states, including states with Republican governors. Now, that is foolishness, recklessness, and irresponsibility. But that's what they did. We didn't do that. They did that. Now, if we open the government, get contracts going again, get small businesses to stop threatening small businesses who have nothing to do with this, then we can go to the budget conference and open up everything for negotiation. Maybe we can do the medical device tax. Maybe we can do, I'd like to work on flood insurance. For one, my constituents are going crazy. Flood insurance has gone up tenfold. I can't even get to a negotiating table on that. We'd like to pass the WRDA bill in Louisiana. I'd like to see the Keystone Pipeline negotiated. I'm for the Keystone Pipeline. The President is against it. But maybe we can find some way forward on that. But we can't go anywhere till we get out of 8 lanes of traffic. And the only way to do that is to admit you were wrong, open the government up, and then go to conference and put everything on the table and let's talk. And I yield the floor. I see my good friend from Connecticut here, and I thank him for joining on the floor today and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, before I make my remarks, I have a brief unanimous consent request. That is that a request of unanimous consent that the period of morning business be extended until 5 p.m. today with all other provisions of the previous order remaining in effect.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank my great friend from Louisiana for her remarks and for all the work she's done to stand up for her constituents, but also for small businesses. I think she makes a great point that right now there are thousands of small businesses throughout my state, the Northeast, through your state as well, Mr. President, that are waiting for loans from the SBA. They can't get them because right now the SBA is essentially out of business. That right now is having a detrimental effect on our economy. I want to thank her for her great advocacy on behalf of small businesses throughout Louisiana and across the country. Mr. President, there's a lot of truth to the fact that there can be mutual blame thrown around this place very often when it comes to the reasons why we haven't solved a lot of our most vexing problems as a nation. The deficit, for instance, didn't get to be the size that it is without both parties playing a role in the fact that we still sit back without the will to try to take on that enormous problem and burden that we're leaving to our kids. That, I think, is due to both Republican and Democratic intransience. So there are a lot of things that happen here in which you can very accurately and appropriately assess that both sides of the aisle have been part of the blame. This is not one of them. This is not one of them. When it comes to trying to figure out the reasons why our government is shut down, it is pretty simple to explain how we got here. And yet, I've heard a lot of my friends on the other side blame the majority leader or blame the president for the shutdown. I've even heard some newscasts try to suggest that it's just sort of good old-fashioned generic gridlock here in Washington that has led to this shutdown. Mostly the American public gets it. I think mostly the American public understands that this is essentially a shutdown of the federal government caused by a small band of ideological conservatives in the House of Representatives called the Tea Party. And I've sort of tried to struggle with how to explain this to the handful of people back in Connecticut that still don't really understand what's going on here. And although there's really no way to create an analogy that works for this, I mean, this shutdown is so ridiculous, it's so unique that there's really no metaphor that works. I've tried this one. So imagine that there's a couple and they live in Boston, let's say. And the wife really loves living in Boston, but the husband's sort of been fed up with Boston for a little while. He wants to move to the West Coast, let's say to San Francisco. But they've been living in Boston for a long time, and they have this disagreement as to what to do next. And they've been having it for a while, they just haven't sorted it out. But they chose to live in Boston, and so that's where they continue to be. And one day the husband comes home and just says to his wife, you know what, I've had enough. I've had enough. I want to move to San Francisco. And if you don't agree, I'm going to call up some contractors and have them come over and take the roof off our house. She says, what are you talking about? Take the roof off our house? I had never talked about the roof coming off our house. The roof is important. It keeps us warm. It keeps us dry. You're kidding, right? You're not going to take the roof off the house. I said, listen, I'm going to give you 3 days, and if you don't agree to move to San Francisco, then I'm going to call somebody and take the roof off of our house. She says, well, of course I'm not going to do that. Of course I'm not going to move to a place that I don't want to move to. We should talk about that. We should come up with a compromise. We should discuss this. And certainly I'm not going to agree to move to San Francisco if you're threatening to take the roof off the house. 3 days goes by, she goes to work, she comes home, and the roof is gone. He took it off. She can't believe it. She can't believe it. Rain's coming in. It's the middle of winter. It's freezing cold. It's miserable. And he shows up to work on the second day and says to his coworkers, you can't believe what my wife did. She took the roof off our house. Coworkers say, well, what do you mean? I told her we had to move to San Francisco, and when she didn't agree, I told her I was going to take the roof off the house, and I did, but it was her decision. She wouldn't move to where I wanted to move, and so I had to go through with it. I had to take the roof off the house. If you were that coworker and listened to that story, you'd know exactly what was going on. You'd know exactly who to blame. You would associate yourself with the decision that the wife made to say, forget it, I'm not moving somewhere with that threat hanging over my head. And you'd back her up when she said, put the roof back on the house before we start discussing about where we're going to live next. That's essentially what's happening here. We had always assumed that the operation of the federal government was not something that we negotiated over. Just like the woman in my analogy assumed that the roof being on the house was just not something that she had to worry about disappearing. And yet here we are. The government is shut down simply because of the demands of a small group of Tea Party Republicans in the House of Representatives. Now, their demands in this case is that they want the health care law repealed, despite the fact that it was passed by 2 legislative bodies, signed by the President, upheld by the Supreme Court, verified in an election in which a president who said he would implement it got reelected by a huge margin, and every single senator in this place that supported it and ran for reelection got reelected. That's their demand in this case. And as the senator from Louisiana said, we should react just like we would expect that woman to react. We want the government back up and operating, and then we'll talk. I want the roof back on my house before we're going to discuss where we're going to live. And this isn't about politics any longer. This isn't about inconvenience. We're now going into the second week of this shutdown, and, Mr. President, it's starting to ruin lives. Like Melanie Rhodes from Bridgeport, Connecticut. A few years ago, Melanie was homeless, living out on the streets. Things were really, really tough for Melanie. And Melanie got pregnant, had a little boy about 2 months premature, wonderful little boy named Malachi. Malachi had some developmental issues right off the bat, but she knew that her life had changed and that she had to do everything possible for her little boy. And so she got him into Birth to 3, our early screening program. They identified the problems he had. He got connected with a Head Start program in which he enrolled at about 9 months old. And Malachi is still behind his peers at 3 years old, but he's doing a lot better. He's beginning to finally communicate with a handful of signs, and every day that he's been in that Head Start program, his life and her life has gotten better. And you know what? Even though she has been struggling through the worst recession of her life, of my life, of most of our lives, she has started to turn the corner as well. She applied everywhere over the last 3 years. She did everything we would have asked of her to try to find a job. She applied to Walmart, to Walgreens, to McDonald's. And finally, just in the past few weeks, she got a job as a bus driver. She had completed her training. She was just waiting for her background check to come through, and she was going to start her job in a couple, actually not even a couple weeks. I think it was a matter of days. She was going to start her job. Well, she stayed up all night last Monday night, past midnight, watching CNN, watching the news to see if the government was going to be up and operating, because she knew that the Bridgeport Head Start program runs on a budget that expires at the end of September. And so that was one of the handful of programs that would shut down immediately upon the shutdown of the government. She woke up on Tuesday morning and hoped against all hope by calling Head Start to just see if maybe they were going to be up and operating, and they weren't. They had shut down. Bridgeport told 1,000 families across southwestern Connecticut that they couldn't show up for preschool that day, that their families had to scramble to find some coverage or child care. And for Melanie, it was a double disaster, because she's got a child with developmental disabilities, and she can't just have anybody take care of him. And so she's had a hard time finding someone, and she's now going to be faced not only with inappropriate care for her child, perhaps setting him back developmentally, but she also probably can't start that job that she was waiting for as well. Take that situation and multiply it times 1,000 just in one city in Connecticut. Then look at the fact that that problem could be multiplied 18,000 times over the course of next week as more Head Start programs shut down. And you start to see that this shutdown is not about politics, it's not about inconvenience, it's really about people's lives falling apart. What about the 1,500 workers at Sikorsky Aircraft, many of which are in Connecticut, the majority of which are in Connecticut? They have about 43 employees from the federal government that inspect the helicopters as they go down the assembly line. But because those helicopter assembly lines, making Black Hawk helicopters for the U.S. military, they move pretty fast, if they don't have those inspectors for a handful of days, they can't continue to move the assembly line. So on Friday, 1,500 workers were furloughed from Sikorsky Aircraft, let go until those inspectors are back on the job. 43 inspectors equal 1,500 private sector layoffs. You know what, when you get laid off from a job, sometimes if you can see it coming, you can try to make arrangements. If you're on a paycheck-to-paycheck basis where everything that comes in goes right back out again to pay your food bills or your mortgage bills or your student loans, whatever it may be, if you can see the layoff coming, then you might be able to scramble to try to find a part-time job or just save a little bit more for the final few months of your employment. But when you get a notice that in 2 days you are going to be laid off for an indefinite amount of time, there's no way for the people that were living paycheck to paycheck to put their lives together. As Senator Landrieu said, that results in mortgage payments being missed, in credit ratings going into the tank, lives being ruined off of a purely political crisis caused by a handful of right-wing Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I hear my friends on the other side of the aisle and Speaker Boehner say, yeah, but if the Democrats would just negotiate, would just compromise, we could get this thing done. Well, Mr. President, before I give the floor to my friend from Rhode Island, let me just say 2 things about that insistence from Republicans that the problem here is not their demands that the health care law be repealed before we open the government, but it's that Democrats won't sit down and negotiate. Well, I think the senator from Louisiana said it best, it makes no sense to negotiate with a gun to our head. Open the government and we'll sit down and talk about anything you want to talk about. But let's also discuss what the positions of the 2 parties are. Republicans want the most important achievement of President Obama's first term repealed. We want the government to just continue to be operational. Republicans want a law that will ensure 30 million more people with health care taken off the books. We want the government to just continue to pay its bills. What I'm trying to say here, Mr. President, is that we don't actually have demands. All we want is for the things that our constituents have always expected to happen to continue to happen. All we've asked for in this crisis created by Tea Party Republicans is for the government to be open and for the government to just continue to pay its bills. We could make a bunch of our own demands. Heck, I think that it's ridiculous that we don't have background checks on the purchase of firearms in this country. But I'm not saying that I'm going to shut down the government unless I get my way on background checks. All I want is the government to be open and for us to pay our bills. And second, normally you negotiate when you don't have consensus. Normally you sit down and compromise when 50% of the Senate and 50% of the House don't agree to the exact same thing. That's the very reason why you have to sit down and talk, because you don't have consensus. We do, Mr. President. We have a bill, which is the clean continuing resolution, and otherwise just keep the government up and operating for another 6 weeks on the same rules that it used to be operating, that we got, I think, 54 votes, 55 votes for here in the Senate, and is publicly supported by the majority of the House of Representatives. Why would we negotiate when we already have a bill that is supported by the majority of the Senate and the majority of the House? The only thing that has to happen in order for the government to get back up and on its feet is for Speaker Boehner to call a vote on that bill. It makes no sense that Speaker Boehner says, sit down and negotiate, when there is already a proposal pending before the House that has the support of the majority of both bodies. We don't have a lot to negotiate over because all we want is the government to open and for us to pay our bills. We don't need to negotiate because we already have a proposal that enjoys the support of the majority of this body and the majority of that body. Tea Party Republicans should stop holding this country hostage to their ideological demands. Speaker Boehner should call a vote on this bill tonight, and this totally unnecessary, totally self-created crisis could come to an end today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.